Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. Beautiful day here in Rhode Island. We are traveling down to Charlottesville to the University of Virginia. Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department, joins us. Professor, thanks so much for taking the time.
I'm always happy to do it.
Okay, not a lot going on in American politics right now. Let's travel down to Florida together. Legal proceedings today on the search warrant and the underlying affidavits of the Justice Department in getting that warrant approved to move forward with the search. Walk us through what's taking place and what does it mean?
Well, this is sort of unheard of. The fact that the warrant itself and the inventory of items taken were released last week would, under ordinary circumstances, be sufficient. The affidavit tells the judge the evidence that's required and why the warrant's needed in the first place. And so this is going to provide additional information, if it's unsealed, as to what specific crimes or logic the Justice Department had for taking these items from Mar-a-Lago. The other thing that's really upsetting about it to a lot of people is that the FBI and other law enforcement officials have been under attack for the last couple of weeks from Trump and his allies. Unfounded attacks that have to do with a raid that wasn't really a raid and violating the law when they didn't violate the law. This further undermines the security and privacy that these agents are accustomed to and that's required for them to do their jobs. And so it's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to carry out their responsibilities if this winds up getting unsealed.
Usually the affidavits become public, they become part of the court record when the charges are filed. And the affidavit for the warrant is probable cause, right? I mean, that's the standard that judges use. There's enough stuff there within the affidavits by the agents to move forward. Go ahead.
That's right. And so because charges have not been filed, at this point, it would be in a lot of ways seen as interfering with the Justice Department's investigation and letting the American public know sort of the ins and outs of how these investigations work ahead of time when, the privacy and the national security issues at stake might not be fit for the average American citizen's eyes.
A number of prominent Republicans called for the defunding of the FBI. I mean, in my lifetime, there's always been a close alliance between, I think, in many ways politically. FOPs have a tendency to endorse Republican candidates. Republicans have been always perceived to be stronger on issues of law enforcement. That seems to now be splintered. Mike Pence took the opportunity yesterday to call on fellow Republicans to reinforce their support for law enforcement and specifically the FBI. How is all this playing out politically?
It's kind of crazy. There are congressional candidates across the country who are now saying that the FBI needs to be abolished. So not only should they be defunded, but they shouldn't even exist. And I've seen various interviews with congressional candidates. There's one in Florida, for example, running in a Republican primary, who clearly has no idea what the FBI does. And, for a long time, we've known that the American people haven't necessarily understood the nuances of checks and balances and separation of powers. They haven't necessarily understood the specific process about how a bill becomes a law. But we've now reached the point in time where even when they're given information, they dismiss it. There are candidates that are saying that the FBI does not actually track down people who are trafficking human subjects. They're saying that the FBI does not play an active role in thwarting child pornography rings. This is just completely untrue. Moreover, without the FBI, there's no way that local and state law enforcement officials would be able to do the work that they're doing. So it's a really scary proposition to think that because the FBI, which is nonpartisan and is just following the rules of the Justice Department, which is also nonpartisan, can be attacked in this way. It's going to make it a lot more difficult to find people who are willing to serve, but it's also posing a major threat to national security within the United States.
Yeah, listen, I've known a number of FBI agents over the years. None of them could be confused for bleeding heart liberals from their own personal ideology. Let's put it that as a minimum. But isn't this just the absolute, this seems like the Democrats would do this, right? Here the Republicans had a huge advantage over the Democrats. Democrats after George Floyd, many prominent Democrats, including members of the House of Representatives, called for defunding of police. that was out of step with how most Americans feel. The Republicans have now taken that political win and flipped it and have now turned it into potentially that the Democrats could be perceived as the ones more concerned about the rule of law, law enforcement, public safety, etc.
Right. I mean, what's really interesting here is that the Democrats were calling to defund the police. It was a terrible slogan because it didn't actually indicate what they wanted. They wanted a shifting of funding so that there would be more community policing, there would be more support for community policing and major criminal justice reform. They were not actually saying, like, let's get rid of the police. Now, obviously,
I'm going to jump in there.
There was language, and the Republicans were able to run with it. But I mean, it was very difficult to find, you know, sort of establishment Democrats who in any way believed that we should actually get rid of the police.
There were a couple of members of the House of Representatives who wanted to get rid of the police. And certainly in the city of Minneapolis, there was a local ballot item to de facto phase out the police department and transfer many of those functions into social service agencies. So listen, the Republicans had the advantage. They seem to be giving it right back going into the midterms. I do want to talk about...
I would also note, though, that, you know, the kinds of reforms that we saw proposed in Minneapolis were not embraced by an overwhelming majority of Democrats in Congress or Democrats across the country. The calls to defund the FBI and also to, you know, the threats that FBI agents and their families are now receiving are far more prevalent than anything that we had seen during the criminal justice reform movement around Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. So, you know, I think that in a lot of ways, these really are apples and oranges.
Let's jump over to President Biden. He's on an absolute winning streak. He is getting major pieces of legislation passed. He's gotten more legislation passed in 2 years than really you can remember any president in his first 2 years. It started slow and it was awfully bumpy and pretty ugly, but now he's on a roll. Some of these things are bipartisan, like the gun control legislation, and yet he has the most abysmal approval ratings of any president. How did these two things work out? And is it time to blow up the media room in the West Wing and start again with a communications office?
Well, I do think that his approval rating went up something like 2.7 percentage points, which might not seem a lot, but it's the first time it hasn't continued to nosedive. So maybe this is...
Is he above 30%? What's he about, 30, 38, 39%?
You know, it's something. I think there are a couple of things going on. The first is that he's going to continue to see low approval ratings because people care more about the economy than they do about legislative accomplishments until those legislative accomplishments translate into dollars they have in their pockets or opportunities they have when they're seeking new employment. However, we are seeing a pretty substantial shift, especially when it comes to the United States Senate and what the forecast looks like for 2022. And so what this means is if states like Pennsylvania and Colorado and even Utah are now trending toward the Democratic candidate, it's possible that Biden's approval rating doesn't necessarily have to be much higher than it is if other candidates can claim credit for helping enable the legislative successes that he's had. And those other candidates don't have the economy hanging around their necks like an albatross. So Biden has more time than these congressional candidates do to, you know, make an argument and to really see an increase in approval rating. These legislative successes are going to be key if the Democrats want to stop the bleeding and maybe even hold on to one chamber.
Okay, let's go to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, his candidates in the Republican primaries just keep winning over and over and over again. I don't know what the percentage is, 70%, 80%, but if a candidate's got a Trump endorsement, they seem to win, you know, 80% of the time.
Well, Donald Trump is clearly the leader of the Republican Party. And in these Republican primaries, candidates that have been endorsed by Donald Trump or who have embraced Donald Trump even without his endorsement are doing better than those who voted for impeachment. If we look at the 10 members of the House who are Republicans seeking re-election this time around, because remember, several of those who voted for impeachment chose not to seek re-election, 8 of the 10 lost their primaries, Liz Cheney being the most recent victim. That means that when we look at the Republican primary electorate, we're still seeing a group of people who are far more like Donald Trump and like what he did than people who are like Liz Cheney and believe that the rule of law and democratic freedoms are under assault. That might help the Democrats in some places in November, especially in purple districts or purple states, but it's going to mean that in ruby red territory, some reasonable Republicans are going to be replaced with election deniers, and that's generally a bad thing for the country and a good thing for Donald Trump.
Let's talk about the implications of that. Are there any cases, I certainly remember when the Tea Party candidates knocked off some, they weren't even moderate, I can't even call them moderate. I mean, Richard Lugar lost in a Republican primary in Indiana, a longstanding Republican senator, not exactly a moderate, pretty conservative, but lost to a Tea Party candidate, and that Senate seat then flipped to a D. Is there any situation where these Trump candidates who have defeated the more moderate, in some cases incumbents, are going to end up costing the Republican seats?
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of House races across the country, not necessarily enough to tip the balance, although it's a little bit unclear, where there are Republicans who won primaries, and these are people who just are not at all competitive in a general election. So if the Democrats can get turnout up, especially among independents, they might be able to take back some of those seats. But we see it in these Senate races too. Pennsylvania is among them. Dr. Oz, who was a Trump candidate, is making it very easy for Fetterman, who was basically off the campaign trail for several months and now says he was all but dead, to win this election. And so,
Fetterman had a stroke, did not campaign for 3 months, nearly died, and is up about 20 points.
Right. And I think that with Dr. Oz, who was a Trump candidate, who clearly has several liabilities on the campaign trail, his most recent one, going to a Wegmans, not calling it Wegmans, and talking about the ingredients that you need to buy crudité, that's not necessarily the kind of message that resonates with the typical Trump voter in Pennsylvania. And so,
what was he making? What
crudité.
I don't even know what that is. You've
got a vegetable platter.
A vegetable platter. Yeah, you've got to be some fancy Dr. Oz or Dr. Lawless to even know what that is. But from working class people like us at GoLocal who live in places like Pawtucket or Pittsburgh or Scranton, we don't connect with that kind of talk.
Well, I would say that, I know what it is, but I don't really, any normal person wouldn't talk about that, especially in a campaign ad, right? Like it doesn't demonstrate any ability to understand what the average citizen is going through. And so I think that in some cases, these candidates who were really not vetted are going to make those kinds of mistakes, which sort of demonstrate that they're completely out of sync with voters. And in other cases, they're going to say, and they have been saying such outlandish things that it might push, it might be enough for Republicans to say, you know what, I just can't hold my nose and cast a ballot for this person. The other thing to keep in mind here is that the abortion issue is actually dividing the Republican Party. And so there are many Republicans who believe that in a lot of cases, situations like rape or incest or the life or health of the mother, that abortion should be legal. A lot of these candidates don't. And what that means is that Republican voters might not be that enthusiastic on Election Day to cast ballots for these people. So there are risks involved in the strategy that the Republican electorate has employed here. We'll see if the risks outweigh the benefits.
But on the House side, Democrats have a margin of 7, it sticks in my mind, presently. That's going to flip. They're going to be down 20, right?
2 weeks ago, I would have said probably. Now, I don't know. I think part of it depends on how disciplined a campaign the Democrats can run. Part of it depends on
Can you use both those words together? Discipline and Democrats campaign?
I do think that what happened in Kansas with the abortion vote might be enough to generate a sense of discipline among some of these Democrats who might not have traditionally had it, right? We've seen that Democrats and independent voters are prioritizing this issue in a way that they never have before. And it's just as important to them as abortion restrictions are to Republicans, which is, again, something that's not typical. So I think there's a path there. The legislative successes on the part of the Democrats also highlight what can get done when everybody is working together. And so if these districts flip, the reality is there's still a Democratic president for the next 2 years, so the Republicans won't be able to get anything done. they can continue to obstruct and keep the Democrats from being able to achieve their goals. But it's not like they are going to be able to implement any of their hopes and dreams over the course of the next 2 years. And so I think Democrats need to continue to hammer home that a lot of what the Republicans are promising is based not on the next 2 years, but in the hopes that they would have unified partisan control and a Republican back in the White House.
Let's come up to Rhode Island. Obviously, a number of hotly watched races, some of them down in D.C., the governor's race and the 2nd congressional district race. Let's talk about the 2nd congressional. Alan Fung, for the 2nd time, has picked Kevin McCarthy over Rhode Island. It's the only way you can possibly think of it, and is flown out to some leisure spot, some exclusive leisure spot, to participate in some high giving donor event. Just
where I'm
bizarre.
sure they served crudité.
I don't even know what that is. So is he? Here's a guy who's up in all the polls, whatever the value of the polls are. The polling this cycle is not of high quality. We're seeing plus and minus 5% with 40% undecideds. I mean, I'm not sure what value and if the sampling's high enough and the credibility of these polls, but they are what they are. He's up in these polls, and he seems to be just very unnecessarily making these very public missteps.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the polls are concerned, I'd say that even in a crummy poll, I'd rather be up than down. Right? It measures something. It might not be generalizable. It might not be that accurate. It might not forecast the future. But at that snapshot in time, among those people, they prefer Fung to Magaziner. It's, to me, not that surprising. If Alan Fung is elected and is sent to Congress, he basically reports to Kevin McCarthy, and he is part of the Republican conference, and he is one of the votes that will be needed to have them, get their jobs. And now, not on every vote, they would probably have a larger majority than the Democrats have right now if they do manage to take back the chamber. But I think that what Rhode Islanders need to realize is that now, on more than one occasion, he's demonstrated that the fundraising power that Washington Republicans are able to generate suggests that he's going to be more loyal to those Washington Republicans and to Republicans in the House of Representatives than the unaffiliated voters in Rhode Island who might have decided to give him a shot. This is not about being a Republican mayor of Cranston, Rhode Island. This is now about being one of 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, where party loyalty is a thing, and it's rewarded if you want to climb that ladder. So I think the photo ops with McCarthy that obviously the Fung campaign tried to downplay should be what Rhode Islanders think about when they decide whether to cast a ballot for Alan Fung.
Now, the flip side is, here's Seth Magaziner, who's been the general treasurer for 7+ years, and in the Democratic primary, in a very flawed sampling of 200 and something, I mean, this is coin flipping polling at this point, is only generating 30-something% of the vote. I mean, you'd think he's running against really complete unknowns. Some of them are good candidates, but none of them had any name recognition prior to the 2nd congressional run, and he can't break 40% amongst Democratic likely voters.
Look, all I have to say at this point is that it's early. People start.
It's not that. It's 3.5 weeks away.
I know, and the other candidates haven't been. I would say that the last 10 days of the election for a primary where no one's paying that much attention are what matters. I can't imagine any scenario whereby he loses, and I don't think that polls like this really indicate much in terms of enthusiasm. At the end of the day, it's almost impossible to imagine that he's not the nominee. So what people are thinking about now is, I think, a Fung Magaziner contest. And when they're thinking about whether they support Magaziner, that's what they're thinking about. They're not necessarily thinking about all of the other candidates in the race. So I think it's way too early to determine to say much about these polls. Again, if you're ahead, it's better than if you're not ahead, but they don't tell us that much at this point in the cycle.
So let's jump over real quickly on the governor's race. The governor seems to be up by a few points, 2, 3, 4, depending on whose public poll you listen to or what you garner from if you have access to some of the private polls. And what I hear is he's up a few points. And there's still a significant undecided. It's not the 30% necessarily that's in some of the public polls, but it's a smaller amount. Is this thing still anyone's game between McKee, Gorbea, and Helena Folks?
I think in order for McKee to lose, something has to happen over the course of the next few weeks that really questions his ability to govern. Gorbea and Folks have been running for a long time, quite visibly, and Gorbea in particular is a relatively well-known entity now in Rhode Island. So if she hasn't been able to break through and chip away, it's unclear what will make that happen. So unless there's some sort of, late August surprise, I think it's likely that he winds up winning the primary.
All right, with that, last question, what should people be watching for? Is the eyes of the nation on this federal judge down in Florida on whether or not to release the affidavits that are behind the warrant to search Mar-a-Lago?
That's certainly part of it. The other thing I would be looking at is, what we find out about Giuliani's testimony yesterday in front of the grand jury and whether an indictment is coming in the next couple of days.
Very good. Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia and a former candidate for the 2nd Congressional District here in Rhode Island. I always appreciate you taking the time and your expertise. For everybody else, stay tuned. Lots going on. We do have a big story about decision by a federal judge awarding over $650 million to two counties in Ohio, hitting the pocketbooks of CVS, Walgreens, and Walmart. Of course, Helena Folks was head of that pharmacy function during the period of time in which this litigation has taken place, and there's states around the country who have follow-up lawsuits. So this is big news for CVS taking this hit, as well as raising a lot of questions for Helena Folks to explain her role in the opioid crisis. Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned for much, much more. And if you haven't gotten a booster shot, do it. You want to go and have fun the rest of the summer and be back and healthy for everybody to go back to school. Thanks, everyone.